Welcome to the .NET Doc Show with your hosts, Cam Soper, David Pye, and not the Scott we deserve, but the Scott we needed, Scott Addy. The .NET Doc Show starts now.
That was awesome.
That never gets old.
It never gets old. Awesome. So we are going to have an amazing episode. We're super excited to welcome our guest today, Heather Downing. Say hi, Heather.
Hey, everyone. How are you?
Doing good. How are you doing?
Yes, doing very good. Can't complain. So what's the idea for today's show? Any takers on that?
I'm going to guess that it has something to do with Heather.
It does. It does. And Heather's amazing. So before we just jump right into things, I wanted to share this amazing story. And I think I actually talked about this last week or the week before. We had Ed Charbonneau on, and he was talking about some of our amazing hallway track conversations at different developer conferences. And that's a thing that we're huge advocates of. And I hope that this show actually kind of serves as that moving forward. But Heather was the closing keynote at DevReach in Bulgaria. And I know that Scott and I were both lucky enough to be there, and it was absolutely amazing. So I just want to say thank you for such an inspiring keynote.
Oh, thank you so much. It's nice to reminisce about being outside of my country right now.
Right.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some things that scare a lot of people. Mm-hmm. Sound good? We're not in October yet, but I think I'm getting everybody ready for Halloween. So just fair disclosure here. I work for Okta, and Okta is a third-party identity provider. So this is another option that you would choose for things like Azure AD or AWS Cognito, Auth0, etc. Okta has a very large suite of options, but I work for them on their developer evangelism team. So my specific role is I get to talk to all the .NET community, which is, of course, my favorite. So something that I've run into almost every time I give a talk is complete confusion about how to think about OAuth and OIDC or OpenID Connect. So I've got a couple of thoughts around that I want to walk through first, if that's okay with you guys.
That sounds fantastic to me. You know, I would add to that. Typically, what I see in the community is if you've never done a lot of security work before, you hear a term like OIDC and you get the deer in headlights look. The eyes just glaze over and you kind of just shut down. You assume complexity is headed your way and you want nothing to do with it. I'm hoping Heather is able to dispel that myth for us.
Yeah, because it's super scary, right? It is terrifying. Like, I think security is one of the most difficult aspects because it's such like a high pressure thing. Like, you can have bugs in code, but security has such larger implications to application development, right? Like, if something goes wrong, it's like headlines across articles and Troy Hunt's blog.
Oh, and it's only getting worse. I don't know if you've noticed this, but it's only getting worse, especially as we become more and more global in everything that we do, because we're not just dealing with things within our own country. Now we're dealing with the differences between what is allowed in China or what's allowed in India, what's allowed here, what happens in the EU with, you know, what is allowed for people to know about what is being done with their data. It's a lot, right? It's certainly a lot to take in. One thing that I really appreciated about learning from this amazing team that I'm on is that most people that are devs, unless you are a security developer or somebody who is in charge of the architecture for that, mostly you want to get your use cases done, right? You want to focus on the business logic that you're doing for your company. Right. So that's where not building out all this stuff and having to maintain, you know, your thumb on the news every 2 seconds and figuring out what kind of standards are being released, you know, by what organization. This is why you would defer this, right, to another it could be, again, it could be another organization or whatever. It doesn't mean that those of you who just love to do those kinds of details can't build this yourself in .NET. You absolutely can. But why would you do that? And I'll tell you why. I was a part of 2 different projects that was spearheaded by an architect who really didn't trust any sort of security anywhere else. And so he really wanted to control that. And that was great until there was some sort of problem, some sort of security vulnerability inside. Specifically, this was JavaScript, but something that came out, it was a big Trojan horse, right? And he wasn't aware of it because he was on vacation. So our client, all of our customer base got compromised because we didn't follow any other standards except for the basic standards. It's just a lot of work because the maintenance around that is just astronomical. Right. Now, there are other ways that you can certainly farm it out. There's definitely lots of repos out there that you can pull packages down for. But if you want to not have to deal with it at all, you just want a couple of things. You just want, give me the user logged in or not logged in, and let me go do the things with them.
Right.
If that's what you want, that's why you would use a third-party identity provider, because that way your users can live there. For example, during this whole, oh my goodness, I'm going to say this incorrectly, so I want to make sure it's not. I'll just give you the acronym for that. But GDRP, right? Mm-hmm. We're talking about personally identifying information. I didn't think anything about it even 10 years ago when I was doing web forms and stuff. I mean, I had stuff in our SQL database that you should definitely not have in there. If you don't, as a developer, this is how you can educate yourself, right? You can educate yourself about what is not, like what kind of personally identifying information should I not put in a database? That's the first way you can educate yourself. It's an easy Google to put it out there, right? So then where do you put that? Because you want to know who the user is, right? How are you going to be able to say, welcome, David Pine, and if you don't know who they are and you just have a random ID, right? It's not helpful. So what you're doing is by moving that really important information to an identity provider, you're letting them deal with it. In fact, the user can go directly to that identity provider and change their own stuff or download their own stuff. You don't have to be a part of any of that. You don't have to build the login. You don't have to build registration. You don't have to build a change password. It's already there. I can't tell you how many times I built a change password screen.
Oh, those are the worst, aren't they?
Well, because it seems like it's really repetitious, right? That's not the interesting part of what we're building that's super cool, or maybe not so super cool, but for like the company we work for. Or maybe it's even a startup. There's a whole bunch of startups with lots of different needs, and they don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this.
Well, I think that's really interesting, though, because I just want to echo what you said. And I think that security would probably be one of those things where it is a lot like more boring to kind of work on, right? As a developer, you kind of want to work on things that aren't that. Yes,
absolutely. I don't think it's boring now, but that's because, man, again, I spent some time with Niall Merrigan and Troy Hunt and, Barry Dorans, amazing people that just really captured a little bit of my imagination around it. But, spending time in security, you get a little grim look at the world. So, and I'm a pretty happy person, so I'm okay with teaching you how to interact with a third-party identity provider in .NET. But we got to start with a couple of things you have to know, because you do get to make some decisions, but don't worry, you're not building out the whole user management engine, okay? So here's a couple of my thoughts about that. I'm thinking there's a couple of things that I want to ask you. Let's see if you know who. Okay, I'm going to start with Cam. Cam, do you know what authorization means?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know what authentication means?
Yes.
Do you think all devs know that?
No.
Okay. Just in case you didn't know. There you go. So authentication is who the user is. Authorization is what can they have access to.
And I think that's awesome that you bring this up, because that's one of the things that I always have to touch on when I talk about security with people. They get those mixed up, right? They're like, well, they're the same, aren't they? And it's like, no, they're not.
Well, it doesn't help that both of the terms start with auth.
Right.
It might, yeah. And can I add something to that? I think as an industry, we do a lot of newbies a disservice when we use the term auth. Because, what on earth are you referring to? Is that the two terms collectively or just one or the other?
Yeah, I think the usage of auth-z and auth-in are a lot more appropriate for newbies.
That's a really good point. When it comes to talking about, so now how do we as developers interact with it? Our standard, at least if you're going to do a website or mobile app or something that is externally facing in some way, right? You're going to deal with a standard called OAuth, right? And OAuth does encompass both of these things, right? So that's part of it. So it's important that I establish this is what we're talking about. Both of these things don't need to be in your app. They don't need to be in your database. They can be configured in a portal. They can be managed by your network admin. They can be managed by someone who's not technical. You can decide, hey, for example, let's pretend that you were building out like an HR app or something like that, like something that you could see like all of your paycheck stubs. You can see how much PTO you have, et cetera. Well, when you leave, that's a lot of different places and APIs of information. If you had used an identity provider, there's literally like one place that you just go and revoke them. Or you can just change it to a review only that allows them to see things that are historical even after they leave the company, like my previous paycheck stubs, right? But maybe you don't want them to have access, to your Discord channel or whatever else you have. If you wrap it with this level of authentication, like I know, for example, Slack is one of our really good friends and neighbors there in the building right next to us in San Francisco. And we do it that way too. So if you are no longer at this company, we can just real quick just deauthorize you and it all just cascades down. So this is important to understand. Authentication is, who is this? Authorization, what can they have access to? There are two different places in .NET Core, that's soon to be .NET 5, right? In Blazor, where you get to actually specify which of those things do you want to use in the app, right? Okay.
Absolutely. I want to add something real quick here. We had the real .NET Dave on Twitch say that he actually gets those two things mixed up all the time. And it seems as though with some of the projects that he's worked on, that there's been, security is almost like an afterthought where it just seems at the end of the project. And I think that's one of those things that people take for granted and shouldn't be. Like, it's security should be like at the forefront of all of your application development.
I agree with that 100%. I think, again, as an industry, we need to get to this spot where security is a consideration up front. Much like methodologies like test-driven development, where you write the test first, why not do security-driven development, where the security mechanisms are considered up front before you write any code?
I like that.
Very good point. I'm glad that you think that way. It took me 5 years for my good friend in Australia to break me of not right-click publishing. So you have to understand that we all are in, it's really hard to change some things you've done. And the whole, hey, just do a proof of concept. Hey, just do a thing. You don't realize even your proof of concept, if you push it out to GitHub somewhere, you have no idea what you're sharing with the world unless you do it secure first. And it can feel really overwhelming, but it doesn't have to. Let's see here. So let's talk about OIDC. Are you guys still with me?
We sure are.
Yep.
Cool. So OAuth itself, of course, gets to handle who is, like, what does this person have access to? None of that. It's just, hey, this is a token that works, that is authorized. You can use it. It tells you nothing about who that user is or maybe what kinds of things they might have access to. So there's another layer on top of OAuth that is used called OIDC, okay, which is OpenID Connect. This extends your token and adds fields in basically a group of strings that tells you, hey, here's the user's name, whatever you want. Those are called scopes. So the scope that you have right here might be, hey, this is David Pine, and this is his email address in case you want to display it for some reason. Here is the things he has access to on the site, and it can be done per application. It doesn't have to just be like, here is this for everything. You want to be as specific as possible when it comes to security. His name, you probably want to cascade. Remember that personally identifying information? That might be something that you want at a top level, like a big organization level. But individual things, I mean, I'm in developer evangelism. I want to have access to like our blog. I want to have access to change a couple of things in our GitHub repo, but I don't want somebody in my HR department to have the same access. But we can, of course, cross it there. So this is where OpenID Connect informs you, the application developer, as to what they can see, what they have access to. Okay. All right. And so when it comes to the flow, this is the part that I lose people. So I worked with my good friend, I can't even talk today. My good friend David Neal, Reverend Geek, had done a couple of drawings, which is one that you saw before. And this is kind of what it looks like to do a flow like this, right? He has something called like he wanted to build an API, right? So this bad pun API, because everybody needs bad puns, right? So he wants to share with a whole bunch of contacts, perhaps. So when somebody logs in, that they can share it with anybody on their contacts list. So what ends up happening here is that you don't really want to grant, like sure, I guess you could do an implicit flow here where you hand somebody your Google or your Microsoft email address and password. That is how we used to do that pass through. In fact, banks are still doing that now with mint.com.
That's terrifying.
It is terrible, but there hasn't been a really good way to get those institutions on board. And that is something that they're working on when it comes to the next standards that we'll talk about. But that's an example, right? I always feel weird if it like Spotify wants me to log in directly with my Facebook username and password. I don't feel very good about that. But they had a sign in with Facebook option, right? That allows them to redirect to a sign in screen that I'm used to seeing as a Facebook user, right? And it's the same thing with perhaps Microsoft. Like I use my Microsoft address for a bunch of different things when it comes to taking care of my speaking and where I'm going to speak. It's easier to just use, my live ID, right? So this is what would end up happening is, as the API developer, you're like, hey, I want somebody to be able to share this with their contacts list in their Outlook. Instead of putting that in, it would redirect to whichever one they used here. I love all the different examples he has here. And then it just checks to see if you already have been logged in that browser on the computer before. So instead of annoying you with another pop-up, it acknowledges that perhaps you're already authenticated within that browser right now on that computer or that device, right?
Oh, I love that.
Yes. If it's already logged in, great. Then all it will ask you is, hey, this bad puns API, they want to access your contacts. You want to give that to them and you can deny it or allow it. That's not even something you have to build. This is something that's already built in to the OAuth Flow, which is awesome.
Out of curiosity, is like that prompt for like the contacts, would that be considered like a scope then as part of that flow request, or how does that work?
Yes, very good question. So you as let's say I wanted to use, Apple's also a good one. I wanted to use that identity provider. I wanted to use set up a working relationship to be able to talk to their user base, right? Or Facebook. You have to register your bad pen API with Facebook to say, hey, we're going to be doing this. Can I have a client ID in secret? And then that way I can make sure that whenever you're seeing these requests, that we're good to go, right? So when it comes to this prompt here, that is left up to the user. So even though you can re-requesting it because you've already registered as an API developer with them, they don't have to give it to you. They're still letting the users have the ultimate control over what happens to their data. In fact, most mobile apps will not pass the publishing test if they can't be installed without accessing a whole bunch of additional data. You have to be able to allow a user to say no to a bunch of invasive areas and still work in some way. Even if it's, hey, I'm glad you installed this. If you want to be able to use our maps section, we're going to need access to your location. So you'll have to enable that in order to do it. I'm sure you've seen that before. Like, hey, we'd love to, for example, I had to enable the ability for Chrome to use my camera, right? These are all things that you have to just keep in mind, that each thing, each scope you're asking for, you're going to say, hey, can we have access to this? Can we have access to that? Great question.
So this stream would have not been possible without security.
Correct.
Let me ask another question, and this is a question I commonly hear. If you don't have a great answer, feel free to just say I don't have a great answer. But customers reach for things like ASP.NET Core, and they see that it ships with this magical identity framework, as we call it. And they say, okay, well, according to the docs, identity handles both authentication and authorization. So technically, it's the Walmart of security for my application. At what point does identity fail me and I need to reach for something else, such as an Okta solution or an Auth0 solution or something else?
That's a great question. I love that question. So when it comes to why you would choose that, I mean, again, there's so much already baked in now. There's so many improvements that have happened in the .NET sphere. I'm so excited since it really became open source that we just improved time after time. So what things ship with is great. But the moment that you are like a Ford Motor Company and you want to be able to handle multiple apps, do single sign-on between like maybe using your phone as the way you can open the door to your car, but also have an app that takes a look at perhaps your lease that you've got with them that month. That's a different app because that's dealing with billing. And then perhaps there are also maybe Ford employees that have some internal stuff. Okta can handle any of those situations. They all live right there. And so you not only do you have the workforce identity, you also have B2C, so business to consumer or customer, depending on how you do that. That's where you would want the scalability of something like this, because let's pretend that you built something super cool that tracks, I don't know, let's say it tracks some sort of, contagious illness. Okay. And right in the beginning, maybe it's rolled out by state. So in the beginning, you don't have that many users that hit you. But all of a sudden, it's scaled up because all the states want that. Scaling up very quickly like that to handle which states have what kind of requirements sounds like a coding nightmare to me. And you don't want to handle that in your code. You'd want to shift that responsibility to a configurable user management place. And that's why you would use a third-party system.
That's awesome. And I think that answers a lot of questions because it's so easy to envision source code written in a way where it's hard coded and assuming, making assumptions. And that's something that you should never do.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So Microsoft also does that as well. That's kind of like three different areas, right? Azure AD B2C, and Microsoft accounts can do all these things. It was just a little bit easier for me as a developer to use something like Okta or Auth0 so that I didn't have to build almost anything out except for just consume a couple of things. So when it comes to things I want you to understand as we go through the code a little bit later is some terminology. You ready? Okay. So let's start with resource owner. So that is you. That is me as the Facebook user. That's you as the Microsoft Live ID user. You own your identity and your data. So you are the resource owner. Okay. In our situation, we're talking about B2C customers, right? That's the customer. The client is not the customer. The client is your application developers. That's you. Okay. You are the application that wants to access data or perform some sort of actions on behalf of that resource owner, okay? That brings me to authorization server, which I'm sure you've heard a lot, right? Because you guys have done extensive work with the security teams and like Blazor teams to put together what everything is for like Blazor routing and some of the security stuff there. Authorization server, of course, is something that you would need to either host yourself or you need to use an identity provider to do that, like Okta, right? So that the application itself knows who that resource owner is. So in this case, if you're building this application, you would know that all the users that are coming in would be Okta users, or at least Okta would be the provider of where their data is hosted. Okay? The resource server is the API that you, the developer that's building this application, the client, wants to use on behalf of those end users. Have I lost you?
No, this is good actually. This is because I hear some of these terms sometimes, and I'm like, I think I know what that means, but this is solidifying it. So thank you.
Can you actually go back a slide, Heather?
Yes.
So the authorization server. So we say that's the application that knows the resource owner. How is that different from the term that we see thrown around, STS or secure token server?
Very good question. I really just kind of want to log in and show you something. I'll do that in a second. So when it comes to, let's pretend that you are a subset of users that have access to multiple applications. They can report to just one authorization server that has all that information. So that's the single token that you're talking about, is that it can be used here and it can be used there. So like, for example, even though right now they're completely independent, as I understand from their security team, initially Google had a suite of products and you were a Google user, right? And if you were a Google Drive user, you had access with one token to this Google Slides, to their competing, Excel product, all that stuff. So I would have gone through like the Google Drive authorization server to get to Slides, to get to all that. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Cool. And of course, resource server is, the API that you want to use on their behalf. That's the call, like, where do I go to get that information, right? Oh, and this is so hard. I wish I could zoom in a little bit more, but hopefully you can see it. All right. So the way that this kind of is explained is that the resource owner, your end user, says, hey, everybody needs bad puns, right? So how do I get one? So now you will send the client ID and the redirect URI response type of scope, right, to the authorization server. And in this case, who's the authorization server? Fleamail, right? And if there is an active session, great, then they don't have to prompt them with that login. Otherwise, if there's not an active session, they do. I'm sure you've seen this many times before, right?
Yep.
Great. So then the question is, hey, can we have access to this user's Fleamail contacts? Yes or no? And that comes back to the user. Again, you as the developer aren't part of this flow at all, except for just the initial sending of that client ID over. You just redirected it directly to the authorization server. If the authorization server gets an allow, then it will send an authorization code over to you, the developer, the client, on behalf of that user. And when you have that, then you can send your client ID in secret, registered specifically for your terrible pun of the day application, along with that authorization code, saying, hey, my user already authenticated with you, and see, I was registered with you, so please, authorization server, let me have access to the contacts. It checks it and goes, all right, here you go. There's your contact list. So that's really the flow and how this goes.
And this is why it's so difficult, because even this illustration, and I love the artwork, by the way, that is so many steps involved and so many different servers. And if you were to try to recreate the wheel yourself and do all this, that would be a nightmare. There's so many points of failure. It's just, that's a lot.
I have a slide that illustrates the same concept actually, but and I stole this slide from another premier field engineer when I first came to Microsoft, who used to do a talk on Azure AD, and the way we depict it on this slide is when you go to the bar and request a beer, right? They're going to check your authorization at that time to see if you are authorized to access that resource. Yep. And the way they check that is by viewing your token that you have in your wallet called a driver's license, which came from a trusted, in my slide, I point out, I call it an STS in my slide, but it came from a trusted authorization server.
That's interesting. Well, so what does that mean when people spoof license and they get like a fake ID to go buy beer at the age of 19 or something?
The analogy only works to a point, Dave.
Right. Well, and that there's something that's really important here is spoofing or phishing, right? So if you get an email, poor PayPal just gets this all the time. Somebody will send you an email saying, hey, there's a really important message waiting for you. You have to click log in here, and they will copy all of the same styles of PayPal. And you can see that it looks kind of like a login. Only the URL itself kind of gives you an indication as to whether or not that really is PayPal that you clicked on. And this avoids all of that. This avoids all of that because you have registered directly with that authorization server, right? You've registered. So you are only ever going to redirect to send that user to the real source of truth, to the real identity provider, right? But that's a really good point there. When I first started doing this, I was like, oh, well, so this right here is just OAuth. So this right here is like a hotel room key, right? It doesn't really matter, to the server, like who this is, to you, sorry, not server, to you, the application, who this is, just as long as you can access the context. That's all you really want. You want access. If you want additional information about who this person is, when that access token comes back, it will have an ID token attached to it. That ID token will show you what that looks like. And I have a website that is a good example of that. So if you were to decode a JSON web token, which is what I send over the line, this is what it would kind of look like. This is an example of that ID. There's also different ways that you can, on here, you can see how it would look in .NET if you were to decode it specifically for us or encode it directly within .NET. You can kind of play around with that. We're in the middle of kind of updating this, but there's a couple of other different examples there too. I just wanted to show you that this right here tells me right away that this is part of the ID token that came back, that it's using OIDC. But you don't have to, because hotel room keys don't use OIDC. It's just OAuth. It's just whoever has this key, this token, can they get in? Do they have access to this particular room? Yes or no? That's it. Because the door doesn't care. The hotel room door doesn't care who you are. It just cares, does whoever has this have access to get in here?
Right.
That's it.
Yep. I love that metaphor. That's awesome.
Oh, you can thank Aaron Parecki for that. So if you are interested in more about how this really works in a really simplified way, if you go to OAuth.com, we have an OAuth 2.0 simplified. And this is much of this is Aaron's work. So he talks about what these things all are, how you would use them, what Pixie is. Pay attention to that. And when it comes to what's coming next, there's lots of really cool things that are coming down the pike. I can't even wait to do some of this B2C stuff that we're going to get to do. Surely you guys know about WebAuthn and you know about passwordless, right? You've heard about this idea that you don't have to type a password into whatever this flow is, right? That you can use a different factor.
Well, I know that the Microsoft, not like our Microsoft.com domain accounts, but like your Microsoft account that you use to log into Microsoft properties like Outlook.com and so forth, has a passwordless option that I use all the time.
Yes. So wouldn't it be nice to offer that to your customers?
Oh, it would.
Yes. So we're going to have that rolling out this fall. So Okta is going to let you do that for like your customer base too, so that they can choose, they can use a YubiKey, they can use whatever. It can be SMS, email, whatever they want it to be. So they can multi-factor that way when it comes to additionally including even biometrics as it comes. So anyway, I got that all situated. So let's talk about what happens when you want to get started on this, right? So when it comes to, there's my already done example, you got to have a pre-baked cake on this kind of a show, right? So let's see if I'll just create a new instance here. So when I first started out making some of these like security related .NET apps, I started with an API. APIs, I feel, are a lot easier in a couple of ways. You should still use, there's different kinds of flows you can use. One of the flows that was used very often for that was the implicit flow. And the implicit flow is not something that the OAuth spec board recommends using anymore. Because it was originally put together to deal with the cross-domain issues that JavaScript had or mobile apps had. When it came to, we can't let someone outside of this area, it's not secure. So they didn't want to do the redirect flow. And so implicit flow means that you would include your client ID and secret over the wire. And now they can use headers. Now you can add that inside of the header, but originally they didn't have security headers. That's why the implicit flow was created originally. So now the default way of setting up any sort of B2C like OAuth flow is to use the authorization code flow. So that's what I'm going to do with you guys. And let's go ahead and just create a new project. Cool. I'm going to use a Blazor app because Ed just inspired me, right? All right. I'm going to call this .NET Docs Blazor app. Cool. Let's get that started. And obviously, WebAssembly is a little bit newer than the server app, but I find that right now, Okta is suggesting that we use server app a little bit more for most cases, but we're more and more starting to interact with WebAssembly. I think it's super cool. It just has a completely different way that you would go about some of the security. And you guys would know that because you're the ones writing all this stuff. I have a big shout out to Scott Addy for helping me when I was originally trying to figure this out for even the server side. That was fun. Okay, so let's say that you just kind of landed here, right? Here at the beginning. How do you get started with this? Well, first of all, it's really important to understand that this works in the first place. I'm not saying that it wouldn't always work when it ships, but I just test it anyway.
And that's a great practice. And I do the same thing, actually.
Right. So this one has, I have it here at localhost 443.09, which is fine. I'll just copy that because I'm going to need it later. So as you notice here, it just says hello world. It's not really very personal, right? And you want to add the ability to detect who is coming to this website. And you can use it for a whole bunch of different things. Great. So how would we set up an identity provider for that? That is a great question. So let's go take a look. Let's see if I can actually get this to show on the correct screen. Maybe. Live streaming is my favorite. Okay.
Ours too.
So if you were to land in the, and if you were deciding to sign up at developer.okta.com, once you were emailed your organization, you would land on a dashboard and it kind of looks like this. If you notice that one, it's kind of hard to see right up there. It might not say what mine says. Mine says, Coraline-admin.okta.com is how I would get to this dashboard. But yours might say dev-whatever random number. You can certainly register easier to remember name if you'd like. For me, I absolutely had to because I have a very small cache in my brain, right? So what you get is a couple of things for free. While I do have some apps in here, what I'm going to show you, you will already have out of the box, okay? Remember that authorization server we were talking about? You get one by default. You don't have to configure it. You don't have to set it up. If you were to look at it, it tells you a couple of things. This is just the default. That means if you are just trying to get started and get your head wrapped around this, you don't have to have a whole bunch of different ones. So all we need to know is the issuer, where like that this is your particular organization or Okta account, right? That makes you the issuer. And this would be the same even if you didn't use Okta, even if you used, again, Auth0 or you chose to do something else with Azure AD B2C. Okay, so great, that looks good. Under scopes, I have a couple of things that you could add here. So there's an API scope, which is a custom scope just for client credentials, for example, if I wanted to use it. But the two I want to draw your attention to is this. OpenID, that means that we need to add another section to that JSON Web Token that specifically has that user information, right? Their name, etc. And we have it in a subsection called profile. So I just want to include this scope and you can decide whether or not it requires user consent or not. Okay. And you can add claims this way. Any questions so far? We doing all right?
So far,
Makes
so
sense.
good.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. If you wanted to see what a token looked like, you can go under API to tokens and you can actually create your own, generate some, find some. If you see any suspicious tokens, we tell you immediately and you can revoke them here. Right? Cool. So when it comes to how you would add a Blazor app, I have a couple of things set up here. All right. So let me go ahead and take a look at what I have set up. Let's do this. There you go. So as you can see, we have like 4 different options you could have. I did a lot of work with machine to machine because I have built Alexa skills for like 4 years now, and they are API driven. So I did a lot there. Single page apps are really popular for like any sort of view. But because of the way that Blazor is set up, we will use web. Okay. It will pre-populate with some information, right? So when it comes to whatever you want to name it, we can name it let's see, .NET Docs, Blazor app, right? And you got some base URLs. This is where the fun kind of sets up. So whatever I have set up here, let's see if I can go ahead and open that up in properties. Nope, I think I did it wrong. Hold on. I need the port. Okay, there we go. Okay, if you go to debug, you'll see there's a couple of ports here. There's the app URL, and then there's whether or not you want to enable SSL. As somebody in security, you always do that. I know that they give you the option not to, but don't do that.
Right.
So you would want to take a look at what this is right here. So it's localhost and then the port number, right? So I think I saved it. I believe I did.
There's a copy button next to that too in the properties page that lets you copy it.
Oh, super cool.
And when you enable SSL there, correct me if I'm wrong, but that would then rely upon the SSL certificate existing, which ASP.NET Core apps give you out of the box.
Yes, which is super nice because I remember going through Scott Hanselman's post on how to deal with self-signed certs and a whole bunch of stuff. So it's definitely improved like the process. But let's say that you wanted to not deal with SSL for the sake of your building. You can add more than one URI here. So I could have added another one, right? That is just HTTP. I can also add, you should never add prod here, but whatever. So you can add your QA, you can add, your dev box as well here, so that no matter which thing is hitting it when it comes to development, like different developers perhaps that have their own local things can also hit this, right? So this is where you would add that. And you want to leave it on authorization code. Notice that we just checked it by default, right? Super cool. Something else I want to point out is a refresh token. Who can tell me about refresh tokens on this team?
Not me.
I can, but only after I refresh my memory for 5 minutes.
No pun intended.
No pun intended.
I'll go with the no eye contact strategy on this one. Don't call on me.
No worries. This is an important part of the flow to just recognize that the very first time you hit this as a user and sign in, it'll work. But however long that token has been set to expire, once it expires, that's it. So let's say you're a mobile developer and you don't want people to keep signing in multiple times a day to your app because, whoever is the authorization server director or somebody who has control over this might have set all the initial tokens to be very short-lived because they are really concerned about perhaps somebody else stealing it and using it. So then by enabling refresh token, that means the next time that you get to it, it'll send you a new token.
Now the application, does the application have to manage the requesting of a refresh token or at what layer does that happen?
Nope, that happens right here. Yep. So that's all you have to do there. You don't have to worry about writing any code to that, right? So if you notice, you can add group assignments here and everything. Cool. So this is kind of what it would look like. And once you've created that, you would be able to copy your client ID and client secret. Since I've already set this up, I'm going to go ahead and go back to my application list, and we're going to steal the one that I had set up before. Okay. Only reason why is because I've added some users ahead of time. You can do it here. You can use our command line tool to add users if you want to, just like fake easy ones, or you can enable the ability for self-registration, which is pretty cool. Let's see if I can find out where that is. There it is, registration. You can go in here and say, I don't want to deal with managing any of these people. I want them to register themselves, right? You can turn that on here, and that just adds that flow into the Okta sign-on. Okay, cool. All right, so since this is all set to go, the only thing I wanted to double check here is the redirects. So, okay.
So does this does it offer multi-factor? Did we talk about that?
It does offer multi-factor. There's different ones you can, again, set up. There's all sorts of different flows. But just for this, I wanted to kind of at least get the initial OAuth flow going for you. But yes, absolutely, you can do multiple factors. Okay. So when it comes to this, I just want to make sure that we have the same local host because it changes every time. God bless. Hold on. Okay, so what I'm doing here, in case you weren't aware, is that this is where it's going after the login process is done. And whenever you're logging out, this is also where it's going. Logout is performed by the identity provider, not by you, the developer. Okay, so that means that, oh, okay, I need to go to this area of my app or this callback area. Okay, cool.
We actually have a really good question in the chat that we should address before we move too much further. And the question is, for Heather, is the refresh token stored on the client along with the auth token? Couldn't someone just steal that refresh token?
I don't know the answers to that question, and I'm not a Wikipedia, so I can look it up for you though. I'll ask Aaron what the answer is to that. I don't remember where it's stored. I just know that it's the preferred flow if you want to keep something, if you want to prevent your users from logging in a whole lot. And that is something that the application can decide. So if you notice, you can certainly do it at the authorization server level, but this is you, the app, deciding as well. Like, hey, you know what? We want to force it more often. Banks do this all the time with their mobile apps, right? Is that we want to do it longer on perhaps maybe a website than we do within our mobile app. So this is why they giving you that option. Cool. So that's all set up there, right? So now that it's set up here, I just wanted to kind of show you that I've got a couple of users in here. So that means that these users have access to this application. You can also, again, just enable registration directly for this, and then they will automatically be put in this group of users who have access to your Blazor app. Okay. You can also change that at any point if you want. You, the developer, can use our Okta SDK if you want to do specific user management stuff, but it's not necessary within this. Okay, cool. So let's take a look at making sure everything's all set to go here. So this is what it kind of just looks like out of the box, right? All right. So I'm stealing from my other one here. Probably should drag that over to the other screen so you can't see the cake yet. Hold on. Okay, no cake for you. All right. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up information. Woo! Now this right here, you should definitely put in a key store. Okay, but just for this, I'm not going to deploy this to something like Azure, but you could definitely use, like the Azure key store to handle where your client ID and client secret are, and then replace those values whenever it's published. Okay, so that you keep this out of your repo. And whenever I do that, I'll just put a little, hey, this is where the client ID goes message here. Okay, but this is all that's going to be needed to register, to just kind of hold the pieces of information for our Blazor app. Okay, so that's right here in the app settings. Okay, and the issuer is your specific Okta org. This could say, remember that lovely dev dash number is what you get by default, but you can register if you like. And all it's doing is this URL lets them know that we're going to use the OAuth Flow. And remember that authorization server we got out of the box? That's its name right there. So if you named it super cool authorization server, that is what you would put at the very end of that URL.
But would it make it super cool?
It would, it's all really super cool. I'm inclusive.
Oh, yes, yes.
Very cool. So we've got this going on, right? And we've got a few more minutes to go. And this is going to go pretty fast. Okay. now all we need to do is set up where to go for this. Blazor out of the box has its own routing rules, doesn't it? It has its own way of doing things. So if we're trying to redirect externally in a secure way, there's some things that we have to set up in the first place. And that is within our startup CS, okay? So in here, there's a little bit of things we got to do. We're going to use some things that we're going to need. So I'm going to add more things here. And it looks like, oh, we're going to need OpenID Connect and our identity model library. So let's go do that. Let's grab it. I'm going to manage the NuGet user packages, do that. And let me grab that real quick. This went so much faster in my head.
Oh, you're good. This is what typical developers will do, though, right? So this is a great example of how, it's not just with security. NuGet, the entire ecosystem, finding things like this is what we do. Yep.
I'm going to browse for that. Cool. There's OpenID Connect. If I'm a good developer, I'm only going to use the latest stable release of that.
Nice. Well played.
Where's the fun in that?
The piece that's not portrayed here is the frantic Stack Overflow searching.
Oh, yeah. I do that all the time.
Okay. You should see me before I have to do a YouTube video. Great. So we got that. And all right. So now that that's there, I can actually copy and paste some more code for you. We're going to replace all the code in the configure services method. Ooh. With some additional pieces. Sound good? So let's go down to configure services. We do need Razor pages. We do need all this other stuff. Oh, of course you wouldn't format. Why would you? There we go. We also need to add authentication. So this is using the authentication builder inside of .NET Core and setting up what kind of authentication scheme that we want, okay? Is everybody with me? So we want to set up our authentication scheme, sign in, sign out, and any sort of challenges that we want to issue to the user, right? OpenID Connect is also added because remember, this is all that really matters at the very core level. But since you and I want to know who the heck just signed into our Blazor app, we want to get something important like their name, all right? That's all I have set up here. But I've done favorite color. I've done the last time, automate some of the logging information like, hey, this is the last time somebody, logged in with your account to this particular app, for example. All that stuff can be stored on Okta server, right? So here we got all the setup. This is going to read from that app settings JSON. So that's all you need there. But you still, even though this stuff is all registered, you still have to tell the app to use it, okay? So we're going to scroll down to our configure method, okay? And we're going to add use authentication and authorization because we want to know who you are and we also want to know what you can do.
And I think we should also point out the order matters there. You
oh,
want
yes.
Authentication before your authorization.
Absolutely.
Didn't we find that one out the hard way, Scott?
Yep. Guilty.
That was a real quick response. Yep.
We also need to map controllers, and I'll tell you why. Remember, we set up this like fun redirect thing. Right now, the way that everything's set up, certain things are done by convention. I want to set up a login controller, so it's very obvious whenever the login process is going on to Blazor that that's what I want to do. In order to do that, I want to make sure to map the controllers to any sort of configuration that this is doing. That makes sense? Okay, so we don't have any controllers in here, so let's go ahead and add that real quick. And I'm going to add a controller folder, and then we're going to add a MVC controller. And I'm going to call it, again, by convention, because that matters, add a login controller. Okay, cool. So now that we're here, we're going to add some code. Let's see. Yep. Okay. All right, I'm gonna collapse these for a second, because what really you need to understand is that here's your get, okay? You're gonna need to have this so that it knows how to redirect from your third-party identity provider to here. So we're handling that here. So whenever somebody clicks login within the app, then a couple of things happened. If the user identity is already set to go, then we're going to go ahead and return the content, right? So this way you don't have to, again, ask the identity provider if this user's been logged in if you already know that they are, okay? So that's just for the particular browser that you're using, okay? Cool. Now we have to actually use it inside of our view, right? So let's go ahead and go to the shared folder. We're going to add a new Razor component, which is Ed's favorite. And we're going to just call it a login display. Don't worry, we're almost done. Because we want to add just a display that changes based on whether or not this user is logged in already. Because I want to show something different here. Okay, in order to do that, you're going to have to wrap it in an authorized view. Okay, and that's what it looks like here. If the user's authorized, then we want to display their name. And this is mapping automatically is mapping the JSON web token to the .NET security identity library. And so it's using that right here, the user context, in order to get that user's name. And if they're not authorized, then we want to show them the login button, right? Looks good so far?
Do there need to be any directives at the top of that file?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
Nope. That's a good question. So now that we've got this individual display set to go, we need to add this to our shared main layout, right? So it needs to be right there. So we're just going to add this Razor component right there, login display. But wouldn't you like to know throughout your application whether or not the user is logged in so you can do other things with it? If the answer is yes, then probably you should wrap it with a cascading authentication state. If I were to replace all of this HTML, here, then I would, let me go ahead and move this. Where did it go? Make sure I didn't skip files. I think we're good. Yeah, right here. Sorry. Where's my did I mess it? Oh, I don't think I missed it. Hold on. Oh, that's an app.razor. All right, so sorry about that, guys. So yeah, instead of leaving that there, I would wrap it with a cascading authentication state. And then we could use this access token right here throughout the application. So we're granting the rest of the pages, the Razor pages inside of our app, access to this parameter. Cool?
Cool. Makes sense.
All right. That's it. So let's just run it and see what we see, right? Oh, did I do the wrong thing? Oh, hopefully not. Yep. You guys didn't stop me.
Gotta love Jason.
I have feelings.
On Jason.
I have feelings.
Can I blame YAML?
Okay, you got a point. Good deal. Now let's try that again. Good deal. Okay. And I'm even putting this in Edge for you. Great. So now you notice over here on the right-hand side, we got a login button. And because we had registered this, it automatically is redirected to your Okta.org to handle this process.
Oh, cool.
Yep. And this is where you can change, if in case the user is worried that this is a spoofed page, they can control their own little avatar, like profile picture here that can, depending on whether or not and they can change that at any time to see if it's legitimately their identity provider's login page. And of course, I just changed the background here because it was fun. I'm going to sign in here. So I'm using another users here. And see, now I've pulled the user's name, Jean Gray. And if I want to, I can also log out of that process. So you basically didn't have to write any of that engine. All you did was you added some configuration, and that was it. The rest of it is handled. And now you have access to that user's name's parameter throughout your application. You can change this to hello Jean if you wanted to at any point, as long as you wrapped it in that cascading authentication state tag.
Awesome. This has been great. Thank you so much. And basically in an hour, we have a fully functional authentication and authorization. Did we do authorization? Is that part of this? Or we have security? We have security. So
yeah, we have security. No worries. If you want, we have a couple of other URLs that you might want to use. And I know the rest of your team has been messaging it out to you. But if you want the repo for this, I also have that link down below. You can just grab it from GitHub and immediately pull it down. And put, as long as you register your own Okta org, you're set to go.
awesome. Thank you so much, Heather. This has been amazing.
Oh, thank you guys for having me. It really isn't that bad if you don't mind separating out what it is you want to focus on. And for me, I want to build super cool things in Blazor and .NET.
Absolutely.
Indeed, and use a framework to avoid reinventing the wheel. Security is hard enough. Use something off the shelf if you can.
Well, and there's something to be said for trusting platforms that make it their job to handle all that stuff and instead of reinventing it yourself.
Absolutely, because the next time that there's a big data breach, do you want to be the one to handle that for your users? I don't think so.
No. Well, thank you again so much for joining us, Heather. I know I personally learned a ton in this episode. So again, thank you.
Absolutely. Next time, Blazor WebAssembly.
Right. So who do we have on for the next episode? Anyone know?
I think we have Chris DeMars next week, and he's going to do a formal accessibility audit on our site.
Ooh.
If our site's running by then, who knows?
Amazing.
Well, then I guess we'll see you then. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, friends.
Bye.
Did we lose?